Halloween, 1994.
You haven't heard any more from this controller chick, huh?
No, not a word.
A commuter plane circles outside Chicago, waiting for clearance to land.
Eagle Flight 184, descend and maintain 8,000.
Down 8,000, Eagle 184.
Without warning, the controls snap to the right. The plane plunges straight for the ground. The behavior of the crew and the air traffic controllers would be examined. Pilots would question the safety of an airplane.
The airplane will have a nasty tendency to go out of control.
Investigators travel the world for answers. The crash makes Roselawn one of aviation's darkest words.
Mayday.
It's mid-afternoon on October the 31st, 1994. American Eagle Flight 4184 left Indianapolis, Indiana 15 minutes ago. It's heading to Chicago. There are 68 passengers and crew on board.
Happy Halloween, cowboy.
Flying through the clouds, the aircraft begins to experience some turbulence.
I'm gonna keep them in their seats in this chop. No sense in taking chances.
Captain Orlando Aguiar is in command of today's flight. It's supposed to be his day off. He volunteered for this flight to make extra money. His wife is expecting their second child.
Let's see if we can get above this. Center, any chance Flight 184 can climb to 16,000?
Eagle 184, 18,000.
First Officer Jeff Gagliano is handling the flying duties on this leg of the flight. He programs the autopilot to climb to a less turbulent altitude.
Jeff actually was working on his dad's ranch in Wisconsin just before he came in for that trip on Halloween that day. Getting on a horse or getting in an airplane, those were two of the things that Jeff loved most.
Flight 4184 is an ATR 72, a groundbreaking new aircraft built in France. Cost-efficient and comfortable, the plane has become popular on short runs. This flight is just one of 5 short hops the crew will be making today. It's Amanda Holberg's first day on the job as a flight attendant with American Eagle. She's paired with Sandy Modaf, a seasoned veteran. Aguiar and Gagliano have flown this route countless times and know it by heart.
When you're flying from Indianapolis to Chicago, you're flying through some of the busiest airspace in the world.
As Flight 4184 approaches Chicago O'Hare, the pilots begin the descent to 10,000 feet.
Chicago Center, we have discretion down to 10,000. We're on our way down now.
Eagle 184, right.
In Chicago, controller Michelle Willman is returning from a break. The trainee controller is still working under the supervision of a monitor. She's told that traffic into O'Hare is facing potential delays because of weather. She will have to be prepared to put some flights on hold.
Operations into and out of O'Hare are handled on a priority basis. It's not necessarily a first-come, first-served basis. International flights arriving to O'Hare because of their fuel status get priority, and then the turboprops come in at the end.
Eagle 184, hold southeast on Victor 7.
Chicago Center, roger. Hold southeast on Victor 7. Eagle 184.
Flight 4184 must now fly a racetrack-shaped holding pattern over northwestern Indiana.
Chicago Center, Eagle 184, entering the hold.
Eagle 184, roger.
Aguiar programs the autopilot to keep the plane circling at 10,000 feet.
I'll go up front, see if they want anything.
The crew has little to do as they wait for air traffic controllers to give them permission to land.
Can I get you boys anything?
I'm good.
Stereo? Oh, you don't have a hard job.
We do have it pretty easy. This thing gets a real high deck angle in these turns.
Yeah.
We're just wallowing in the air right now.
You want flaps 15?
We'll bring the nose down.
Sure.
I guess Sandy's going ooh now.
See y'all.
All right.
The crew needs to let the airline know about their delay. It could affect the rest of the day's schedule. Crews use text messages to communicate with dispatchers, so they don't tie up radio frequencies.
Shall I let them know how much fuel we got?
Sure.
Space, F-U-E-L. Is that?
We got 3,600 pounds. Well, folks, once again, this is the captain. I do regret to inform you that air traffic control has put us into a holding pattern up here. We're holding for approximately 20 minutes out of Chicago at this time. I do apologize for all the delays.
That's much nicer. Flaps 15.
Shit, once they let us out of the hold and forget they're down, we'll get the overspeed warning. I can't hold anymore, man.
Just doing circles up here, yep.
Yeah, we got plenty of gas. We could be up here.
Here for a long while.
Hey, bro.
Yeah.
I'm getting busy with the ladies back here.
Oh.
Yeah, so if I don't make it up there, say the next...
15, 20 minutes. You know why.
Okay, when we get closer
To the touchdown, I'll give you a ring.
Oh, no, I'll be up right now.
You haven't heard any more from this controller chick, huh?
No, not a word.
Eagle Flight 184, descend and maintain 8,000.
down to 8,000, Eagle 184.
Eagle Flight 184, should be about 10 minutes till you're cleared in.
Thank you.
The flight is allowed to descend.
Are we out of the hold?
No, just going down to 8,000.
Then a warning.
I knew we'd do that.
The plane is going too fast to fly with its flaps extended.
I was trying to keep it at 180.
Gagliano retracts the flaps. There's a strange sound coming through the fuselage. Suddenly, the control column turns sharply to the right. The controls won't budge. The plane is falling from the sky. The pilots begin to recover control. But then it happens again.
It was coming down too steep to even try to land. It was coming down at a sharp angle, a real sharp angle.
Flight 4184 has crashed into a field just outside Roselawn, Indiana.
Oh my God, they're dead. They have to be. For the speed that it was coming down at.
Hundreds of volunteers arrive at the crash site to offer help, but there's nothing they can do.
There was not much to see of any airplane. You couldn't see no cabin or anything of the airplane. There just wasn't anything left of it.
Both pilots, the 2 flight attendants, and all 64 passengers are dead. The Roselawn crash would soon become one of the most important accidents in aviation history. It will lead investigators to new conclusions about a string of older crashes. The morning after the crash of American Eagle Flight 4184, a team from the National Transportation Safety Board is on the scene just outside Roselawn, Indiana. Greg Fife is the lead investigator.
The morning that we arrived at the accident site, it was cold, it was overcast, it was one of those drizzly, dank days. All you could smell was the Jet A or the kerosene fuel, and because it was muddy and wet, you had that odor or that aroma of dirt. And so with all of those smells, that really evokes some emotion there. And now you have to walk through that field and actually start to do your job.
The crash site is soaked in jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. Human remains are scattered everywhere. The site is declared a biohazard.
With 4184 was one of those types of accidents where there was very little left of the airplane.
Investigators know that the way the wreckage is spread out can tell them how the plane hit the ground.
Because there was a fan-shaped debris pattern and it was spread out over a very large area, we knew that the impact was very shallow, but at a very high speed.
The airplane's 2 flight recorders are found intact in the tail. They're taken to the NTSB's labs for analysis. The data on the recorders could provide the clues investigators need to solve the mystery. But extracting the data takes time. In the meantime, investigators look for the location of key pieces of wreckage.
The first things we typically look for are the 4 corners of the airplane.
The NTSB's Bob Swaim leads that search.
You're looking for the nose and the tail and the 2 wingtips, because if you can tell where the 4 corners of the airplane are, you get an initial idea of whether the pilot was in control or not.
The plane's 4 corners are far from each other. The nose and cockpit are completely destroyed. This tells investigators that the plane hit the ground nose first in a shallow but rapid descent. The fact that the plane wasn't in a steep descent on impact indicates that the pilots had some control in the final seconds before the crash. They just ran out of room to pull up. Investigator Bob Swaim, meanwhile, has recovered some of the plane's instruments, including its attitude director indicator, also known as the artificial horizon. It's a key instrument that tells pilots if they're flying level. If it malfunctioned, it could have misled the crew and caused them to make mistakes.
We had a pretty good idea of the attitude of the airplane at impact, so it would really help at that point to see if the pilots had the same view of the flight that we found as they hit the ground.
Get the lights for me, please.
A lot of the cockpit pieces use a fluorescent paint or something similar, and when they contact each other, little bits of the paint transfer. If we look at those with a black light, we can see things that the naked eye cannot see.
There's a good imprint here.
The force of the impact has left tiny scratches on the shattered instrument. Swaim discovers that the attitude indicator seems to have been working. Its final readings show the plane was leveling off. The instrument coincides with the plane's actual position on impact.
It indicated that at least the flight instruments that the pilots would have been looking at were appropriate, they were proper, that the pilots had something to fly by.
The discovery means that the pilots knew their plane was diving towards the ground. Investigator Greg Fife is getting a clearer picture of the flight's final seconds. Now he wants to know about the history of this flight before it fell from the sky.
One of the elements of the investigation, of course, was to look at air traffic control.
Eagle 184 holds southeast on...
Fife learns that Flight 4184 had been in a holding pattern southeast of Chicago for 39 minutes before the crash.
When we looked at the air traffic control records, we found that the flow rate, that is, the number of airplanes that were going into Chicago O'Hare at the time, had to be reduced because of the weather moving through the area.
Well, folks, I do regret to inform you that air traffic control has put us into a holding pattern up here.
And because of the reduced rate into Chicago, we knew that 4184 was going to have to hold for a very long period of time.
I do apologize for all the delays.
One of the aspects that we found was that one of the controllers in the facility was relatively new. They were considered a trainee.
Had an inexperienced controller put Flight 4184 in peril? Chief Investigator Greg Fife wants to know more about the weather conditions along the holding pattern.
I want weather data, pilot reports, its atmospheric conditions, its Doppler rate, or anything you can find.
Flight 4184 wasn't the only plane circling O'Hare that day. Several other planes were also on hold. They all landed safely. Interviews with the pilots of some of those planes give investigators an important clue.
One after another, they all experienced icing, some as much as 3/4 of an inch.
Many of the pilots report the same thing: ice. Dr. Marsha Politovich works at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. She's one of the leading experts on icing and the danger it poses to aircraft.
It essentially changes the shape of the wing while you're in flight. It creates drag, it reduces lift, it causes performance and handling problems, and it's just not a good thing to have.
Investigators examine weather records from the day of the crash. They find a disturbing pattern of reports of icing all along a cold front near Chicago. But the reports describe the icing as light to moderate. Perhaps the size of the commuter plane was a factor in this crash.
Yeah, different planes respond to icing differently. A large plane will respond differently than a small plane. Reasons for that are both environmental and having to do with the airframe itself.
Large jets generally fly above the dangerous conditions inside a cloud. But the ATR-72 can't do that.
Smaller plane can't fly as high. They're stuck in the icing environment for longer. They may not have de-icing equipment, and if they get in trouble, they may not have enough excess power to get out of it.
Investigators discover that Flight 4184's holding pattern took it through layers of cloud repeatedly. Each time it would have been exposed to icing conditions.
4184 we knew had been holding in an icing event. There were layers of clouds that they had been flying in and out of.
Steve Frederick was flying out of Chicago on the morning of the crash. He flew through the same treacherous weather.
Each time that I went through that cold front during that day, the weather was intensifying, the ice was getting worse, and I was getting more and more concerned.
Frederick asked his captain to pass on a warning about the weather, so that other pilots would be alerted to the danger.
I found out a little bit later that my captain had never warned dispatch, and these pilots never got the warning about the ice that was out there that day. And there's no feeling in the world that can compare to how badly I felt at that moment.
Greg Feith knows that controllers had put several other planes into a holding pattern near Chicago. But they all landed safely after coming out of the hold. This means the controller had not put Flight 4184 in jeopardy. She acted correctly given the information she had about the weather.
One of the issues about air traffic control is that the controllers can't just look at their radar screen and identify areas of precipitation or icing conditions readily. The controllers don't know that an airplane is sitting in icing conditions unless the pilot provides them with what they call a PIREP or a pilot report. So if the crew, in this case, 4184, doesn't provide that information to the controller, then the controller doesn't know that an icing event actually is occurring out there.
Feith and his team wonder if the flight crew simply didn't realize they were flying into icy conditions. The plane's cockpit voice recorder provides the answer.
Can I get you boys anything? Cereal? You don't have a hard job.
You do have it pretty easy. Hey, bro. Getting busy with the ladies back here? Oh.
At first glance, the crew's behavior seems unprofessional and undisciplined.
The first officer was listening to some music. We knew that there were a lot of non-aviation things going on. One of the most contentious elements was how did that affect the crew's performance and their awareness to the situation that was starting to develop.
Well, that's much nicer now, flaps 15. Yeah. Showing some ice now.
Once they let us out of the hole and forget they're down.
But 9 minutes before the crash, the crew had noticed their plane was picking up ice. The pilots must have been aware they were flying through an area of aircraft icing.
You haven't heard any more from this controller chick, huh?
No, not a word.
Then, 2 minutes before the accident, another remark draws the attention of investigators.
Still got ice. I see what you mean.
The crew knew about the ice. Now investigators need to know what they did about it. The ATR-72 is equipped with sophisticated de-icing devices. It's crucial to know what the crew did about the ice buildup on their wings. This time, the flight data recorder provides the answers. Almost 17 minutes before the crash, something sets off the master caution warning. It could signal a problem in one of the plane's systems. It could also mean the electronic ice detector is picking up the presence of ice. The flight data recorder shows investigators that in response to the alert, Captain Aguiar turned the plane's de-icing system to its maximum setting. The NTSB's Charlie Pereira looks into the performance of the ATR-72.
The icing alert system had sounded orally, and they heard it, and they activated protection systems on the airplane. And at the time of the accident, the de-ice systems were on. The complete ice protection system on the ATR-72 airplane consists of a combination of what we call anti-icing, which are hot surfaces that don't allow the ice to form, windshields, and the propellers are also heated on this airplane. And then they have de-ice systems, which are on the leading edges of the wings, what are called pneumatic boots. They're like rubber inflatable chambers that you blow air into and they expand kind of like a balloon, and that cracks in the ice. Then the ice flies off the airplane.
The flight data recorder shows that after he activated his de-icing system, Captain Aguiar also pushed the throttle forward slightly, increasing the plane's speed. This increased the speed of the air moving over the plane's wings, making it harder for ice to settle there. The pilots had done everything they could to deal with ice buildup on the plane. But were the anti-icing systems actually working? The shattered remains of that de-icing system are now the main focus of the investigation.
The airplane was designed in France by a group of French and Italian companies. The de-icing system was part of that design. So the components were made by small French vendors who were located around the countryside, and then they were assembled there in Toulouse into the final airplane.
Bob Swaim arrives in France with pieces of the de-icing system.
I brought some pieces from Flight 4184 to look at.
The key component to the de-icing system is probably not the black rubber boot that you see on the airplane, but the timer that's inside the airplane, or the timers and the valves that control those boots.
The force of the crash has left telltale markings called index marks. They show the position of the valves at the time of impact. Swaim compares them to the original blueprints.
Does anything seem out of the ordinary?
The trip to France has led to yet another dead end. There was nothing wrong with the plane's de-icing system.
Thanks a lot, appreciate it. Thank you.
Investigators are puzzled.
Showing some ice now.
If the crew knew they had ice on their wing and their de-icing system was working, why did the plane crash? Other pilots think they know the answer and decide to speak out. Their decision will dramatically change the course of this investigation. Three weeks after the crash near Roselawn, Indiana, American Eagle pilot Steve Frederick distributes a warning. It says the ATR-72 fleet operated by American Eagle is dangerous in icing conditions. It claims American Eagle pilots have pleaded with the airline and regulators to do something about it, but to no effect.
I drafted and distributed a brochure in Chicago O'Hare Airport, which essentially warned people about the problems with the ATR aircraft and made an outreach to the public in order to try and get something done because nothing was happening.
Steve Frederick has more than a professional interest in the crash of Flight 4184. Co-pilot Jeff Gagliano was his close friend. They graduated from flight school together. Gagliano's death has hit him hard.
He made the comment one time that he would probably wind up dying because of ice in an ATR. And it was eerily prophetic.
A month after the crash, pilot frustration over the ATR's airworthiness boils over. A group of a dozen pilots refuse to fly, citing risky weather. The airline is forced to cancel flights. And then Steve Frederick goes one step further. He voices his concerns on a US network morning show.
We were told this airplane will try and kill you. If you get too slow in ice, the airplane will have a nasty tendency to go out of control.
When I came back to flying after my appearance on Good Morning America, I was summarily suspended without pay.
The public protest leads investigators to wonder if the ATR-72 has a deadly vulnerability to ice.
Merci.
Investigator Charlie Pereira visits the ATR's French manufacturer, Aerospatiale, to learn more about the plane's history.
We embarked on a research effort to try to identify all previous ATR 42 and 72 roll control incidents.
He finds a disturbing pattern.
And about five of those were found to be similar after the fact in our review to the Roselawn case.
One such incident took place in December 1988 in Mosinee, Wisconsin. An American Eagle ATR 42 had been preparing to land in icy conditions at central Wisconsin Airport.
The airplane was on approach in severe icing conditions, described as freezing drizzle and freezing rain.
Captain Mike Bodak was the pilot that day.
We were just on the last two legs of our trip before we'd be done with work. And we were doing our descent. Everything was proceeding normally.
Negative ice, just wet. I'll call the flight center and let them know we're turning inbound.
I hear in the tail a sound like that, but it just got louder and louder. We have no idea what is occurring. I thought initially a propeller blade may have come off. It was as if the steering wheel wasn't connected to anything.
The plane stalls. Its wings can't generate enough lift to keep it in the air.
As I see I'm not getting any of the airplane back, I come up on the power loops all the way. The engines are now really trying to fly. And at this point, I'm getting some of the airplane back, so I make a forward motion to try and break the stall. And it's still going terrain, terrain, and I don't have the airplane back yet. And my first officer says, and I say max RPM. He throws the props from 86 to 100%. And instantaneously, boom, we fly out of the stall.
The plane is less than 1,200 feet above the ground. Captain Bodak has learned a sobering lesson about the ATR.
There was no warning. The plane stalled without any warning. Planes do have warnings for stalls, but in this case, there was no warning. I got the first warning that I was in a stall was I was in a stall.
But other pilots weren't as lucky. An ATR-42 operated by an Italian airline was flying over the Alps en route to Germany in October 1987. The plane lost control and crashed in the mountains, killing all 37 people on board. Ice was the main factor, but the final report blamed pilot procedures.
For investigators, it's really important to look back at historical information about any airplane. You want to look for trends.
What they would find is a troubling detail with this plane's history.
Did any of your studies uncover a wing design flaw?
Charlie Pereira wants to know if the engineers who built the plane could explain why an ATR-72 would go so badly out of control. To his surprise, he learns they knew that it had a susceptibility to icing.
You've seen the flight data from the accident flight. Where would the ice have formed to cause that?
When I asked one of their oldest, most senior aerodynamicists who couldn't speak any English at all, what he thought would be the shape and location of an ice accretion that could cause the behavior that we saw on the flight recorder for the Roselawn airplane. He drew up the airfoil section, a little shape just behind the de-ice boots, and said this was it. And the translation was that this is what will cause this problem.
After the de-icing boot.
Investigator Charlie Pereira is beginning to understand how ice can affect the wings of the French-built plane. If the ice built up behind the boot, the crew would have no way to clear it.
Still got ice.
And even a small amount of ice can have a devastating effect on an airplane. Ice can disrupt the smooth movement of air over the wing. But how could so much ice build up behind the boot? Investigators contact Dr. Marsha Politovich for assistance.
The NTSB called us to help them analyze weather conditions in this case.
Her research shows that the pilots of Flight 4184 likely flew into something they'd never even heard of. Something even more dangerous than ordinary ice.
Based on the weather analysis, it looked to us like the kind of icing that plane encountered was from supercooled large drops. Now, large is relative. What we're talking about large here is about the size of a human hair.
Supercooled large droplets are about 100 times smaller than a raindrop. They form inside storm clouds when the temperature is near freezing. But the drops don't freeze until they come into contact with something solid, like the wing of an airplane. Conditions that day were ideal for the formation of these tiny freezing droplets.
We had all the clues that we needed, a warm cloud top, -8 to -12 degrees C. We had drizzle formation near the top that was probably encouraged by some wind shear near the cloud top, and very little ice in the cloud, from what we could tell.
On every lap of its holding pattern, Flight 4184 flew through layers of cloud that hid a small but lethal element.
They just put that poor guy in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Investigators learned that supercooled large droplets have a distinctive way of accumulating on an aircraft wing. Ordinary ice accumulates on the leading edge of the wing, where de-icing boots can get rid of it easily. But SLD act differently. These supercooled drops hit the wing and slide back over it before freezing. This forms a ridge behind the boots, out of reach of the de-icing system.
So as 4184 was flying in that type of environment, rather than the water droplet freezing on the protected surface of the de-ice boot, it actually ran behind the de-ice boot and froze on the metal surface.
The pilots can't get a good view of their wings from the cockpit. They would have been utterly unaware of the danger taking shape.
For the pilots, when they looked out their side window, they would see the outer portion of the wing. They definitely could not see the top of the wing where this ice ridge was starting to form.
For Greg Feith, the investigation is coming to a head. His investigators think they know why Flight 4184 crashed, but they can't prove it. To make matters worse, the plane's manufacturer suggests that the Roselawn crash wasn't caused by an ice buildup, but by poor piloting.
The NTSB thought it was an aircraft problem, and the French aircraft manufacturer thought it was a pilot problem and not their particular product.
Feith wants to know if there had been problems with ice on ATR-built planes in the past. He finds troubling similarities between some incidents dating back decades. Using data from flight data recorders, investigators look at aileron movements from Flight 4184 and compare them to the other incidents. They discover that on all those flights, the aileron deflected in exactly the same way.
There's no input at all from the pilots.
we knew that all of these ailerons were being commanded to move, not by the pilot, but in fact the disrupted airflow created by the icing event that the airplane had encountered.
The physics of ice buildup explains why the control column on Flight 4184 snapped to the right. Air turbulence on the wing was so powerful that it lifted the aileron, which caused the plane to roll. Since the aileron is attached to the control column by a cable, it jerked the control yoke to the right. The force of the turbulence pulling on the aileron was so great that even two pilots trying to countersteer weren't able to bring the aileron back down.
The forces were determined to be about 250 pounds, so for the pilot, it would have been trying to roll against 250 pounds of aerodynamic force.
Worse, the ATR's control yoke doesn't have power steering, so those forces are transmitted directly to the pilots. The pilots could not fight back against the air pulling on their aileron. For Chief Investigator Greg Fife, supercooled water droplets that left a ridge of ice on the wings are now the prime suspect. But how to prove it?
Now the real analysis began because we had to understand what was going on in flight with the airplane. We had good flight data recorder information. It only told us what happened, didn't tell us why it happened. We had to try and model this icing event some way.
At the time of the crash, NASA was just beginning to study the effect of supercooled large droplets on airplanes.
Back in 1994, pilots didn't know what SLD or supercooled large droplets were. There was very little information in the pilot community, and there was actually very little information in the aviation industry about SLD.
Investigators first turned to NASA for help. Together, they launch a daring experiment. They use a US Air Force tanker plane to create a cloud of supercooled water droplets. An ATR-72 flies behind the tanker. Yellow dye in the water shows investigators how the droplets cover the plane. The test should solve the final mystery. How had ice caused Flight 4184 to go so badly out of control?
One of the primary purposes of flying the ATR-72 in behind the tanker was to understand how the ice accumulated on the airplane, but more importantly, the effect of that ice in varying configurations of the airplane on the flight control surfaces, that is, the ailerons.
Investigators make a startling discovery. A seemingly harmless action meant to increase comfort on the plane may have led to disaster.
Can I get you boys anything?
I'm good.
While American Eagle Flight 4184 was holding, Captain Orlando Aguiar notices that the nose is tipped quite high.
This thing gets a real high deck angle in these turbines. Yeah.
Captain Aguiar knows that the plane's high nose angle was producing an uncomfortable tilt in the passenger cabin.
You want flaps 15?
We'll bring the nose down.
Sure.
Extending the flaps would have the effect of lowering the plane's nose, making the ride more comfortable.
I guess Sandy's going ooh now.
When investigators duplicated this maneuver, they found that it had a dramatic effect on where the ice ridge formed on the plane's wing. The flaps made the icing problem even worse.
By exposing more of the upper surface of the wing to the oncoming water droplets. And that's one of the reasons why we got the ridge of ice where we got it, was because of the flaps 15 configuration.
That's much nicer now, flaps 15. Yeah.
The crew of Flight 4184 is unaware that a ridge of ice, more than a centimeter high, has built up on the surface of their wings.
Eagle Flight 184, descend and maintain 8,000.
Down to 8,000, Eagle 184.
The ice buildup has no effect on the flight until First Officer Gagliano begins his descent to 8,000 feet.
I knew we'd do that.
The descent increases the plane's airspeed. This triggers a warning from the flight computer telling the crew they're flying too fast with the flaps extended.
I was trying to keep it at 180.
Gagliano now retracts the flaps. But the routine gesture has a dramatic effect on the plane's aerodynamics.
When they retracted the flaps, as they started their descent down to 8,000 feet, the airplane pitched back up into a very nose-high attitude.
Airflow over the ice-laden wing was disrupted when the nose lifted back up. That created the turbulence that pulled up the ailerons, sending the plane into a roll. The plane stalled and tumbled from the sky.
Had this crew had about 2,000 to 3,000 more feet of altitude, there's a high probability that they would have been able to salvage or recover the airplane before it struck the ground.
The NTSB has uncovered a deadly flaw in a popular airplane. There's a growing concern that unless something is done, this kind of accident would soon happen again. Investigators conclude that problems with the ATR's wing design make it vulnerable to this menace. The agency that regulates U.S. aviation takes drastic action.
We are going to issue an airworthiness directive this afternoon that will preclude the operation of these aircraft into known icing conditions.
The FAA takes swift action, banning all models of the aircraft from flying in icy conditions. This throws regional airlines like American Eagle into chaos. Public concern over the safety of ATR airplanes grows in the aftermath of the Roselawn crash. The most controversial charge, that the FAA had relied on the French authorities to test and certify the aircraft, then rubber-stamped the results.
Therefore, the ATR-72 was never really tested by the FAA in any way, shape, and form as though it was manufactured here.
The plane's French builder proposes to fix the problem by making the de-icing boots wider so they cover a larger part of the wing. The company also rewrites operating procedures, forbidding pilots from using the flaps or flying on autopilot in icing conditions. In response, the FAA issues an amendment to their earlier directive, loosening operating restrictions on the ATRs. Most airlines decide not to take any chances. They move their ATRs to the south, where a warmer climate would reduce the risk of ice. The crash at Roselawn set off a flurry of new research into aircraft icing and the conditions that produce it.
There's a lot of weather data out there. Satellites, radars, surface obs, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, the collection of data.
New techniques in forecasting are being developed to show pilots where icing is likely to occur and help them avoid it.
But we're working on ways to get it to the people who need it. Dispatchers at airlines, meteorologists at airlines, and now even into the cockpit itself.
Many of those changes will take time to come into effect. Pilots like Steve Frederick think that time will cost lives.
The problem that exists is that there is no technology available today to the pilots or anyone on the ground to accurately forecast or predict where these situations of bad ice are going to occur. Once these airplanes have been exposed to the bad ice, it's too late because these are no longer airline pilots, they're test pilots. And that airplane can fall out from under them and their passengers without any warning and in the blink of an eye.
639 pieces of wreckage are recovered from the sea. 639 pieces that only deepen the mystery of a deadly plane crash.
All right, a little bit more to the right. There.
But when investigators bring up the 640th piece of China Airlines Flight 611, they get their answer.
There was definitely a eureka moment on the dock.
It would be scrutinized more closely than any other piece of debris. On this single piece of wreckage, investigators would find the one clue that would tell them why a modern jetliner with 225 people on board shattered in midair.
Feet. Speed is low, sir. Watch it. Did you feel that?
Target control, descend and maintain. Echo Foxtrot, 126, and 608.
May the 25th, 2002.
Gears up.
A China Airlines 747 lifts off from Taiwan's capital, Taipei.
Taipei approach, Dynasty 611, airborne passing 1,600.
Dynasty 611, Taipei approach radar, contact climb, and maintain flight level 260.
260, Dynasty 611. Autopilot B, engage.
China Airlines is Taiwan's national airline. There are 225 people on board Flight 611. Today's flight is a short one, 1 hour and 40 minutes across the Taiwan Strait to Hong Kong. This route is one of the most widely traveled on the planet. It makes so much money, it's called the Golden Route.
Ladies and gentlemen, the fasten seatbelt sign has been turned off. For your safety, we do recommend that you keep your seatbelt fastened at all times while seated.
Minutes after taking off, Flight 611 climbs steadily above the Taiwan Strait. The plane's autopilot controls the ascent. And then, 20 minutes after taking off, at an altitude of almost 35,000 feet, at Taipei Area Control, the flight vanishes from radar.
Dynasty 611, Taipei. Dynasty 611, Taipei. I've got a plane off radar. China Airlines 611. Its last known return was east 119.67, north 23.98.
Taiwanese authorities quickly launch one of the largest rescue missions in that country's aviation history.
本时段备勤同仁，本时段备勤同仁，请立即至值班室集合。科研麻，你帮我。海顺动幺，海顺动幺，呼叫美方动幺，听到请回答。
我是同时下达。
I gave a clear order that the priority would be searching for whoever was still alive, then bodies, and then, only then, wreckage.
务必全力以赴。
More than 1,000 people take part. Fishing boats, the Coast Guard, and Taiwan's military race out to sea. Flight 611 was 55 kilometers from the Taiwanese shore, just north of the Penghu Islands, when it disappeared. Rescuers find debris floating in the Taiwan Strait.
The first thing we saw was a great amount of wreckage, including landing gear wheels, napkins, knives, and forks.
Wreckage from the plane is spread far and wide. Some items are found on land more than 100 kilometers away in central Taiwan. As the rescue effort continues, Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council begins its investigation into the crash of the 22-year-old plane.
747-200, delivered August 2nd, 1979.
Kay Young is the managing director of the ASC. He'll be leading the investigation.
We're setting up a command post in Penghu Island. Let's go.
China Airlines have had very, very poor safety record. As a matter of fact, it was considered one of the worst in the world. Typically, it had like one major accident every 4 years. This particular investigation was by far the most difficult one. And one of the reasons why was it's in the ocean floor.
The search for survivors goes on around the clock. There were 225 people on the airplane. Nobody is found alive. The bodies are taken to the Penghu Islands to be identified and examined. Since the accident involved an American-made plane, the NTSB joins the investigation. A team of investigators is dispatched to Taiwan. They'll be led by John Deicing in Washington.
We have a very good working relationship with the ASC, the Aviation Safety Council of Taiwan, so we knew that they would ask for and welcome our assistance in the investigation.
Wreckage that's found floating is also brought to the Penghu Islands. Investigators need to know how one of the world's most successful planes, on one of the world's most traveled routes, simply fell out of the sky.
Well, the Boeing 747 is the world's most popular jumbo jet, and it's flown millions of people, probably billions of miles. We were very concerned.
Good morning. I'm anxious to see what you have.
Sophisticated ground-based radar tracked Flight 611 throughout its short journey. It should provide investigators with a much clearer picture of the flight than the radar at air traffic control. Kay Young gets the first major clue in this case. The radar tracked the plane as it climbed on course to 35,000 feet. Then suddenly, Flight 611's signal split apart.
The breakup is quite graphic.
Right when the event happened, it appeared as if there were 3 or 4 sizable pieces of wreckage that were getting radar returns that then began to drift and scatter as they fell to the earth. So that told us that the airplane broke up in flight.
Investigators now must turn their attention to finding out what caused that breakup.
There's all kind of theories about, what seems to be happening of that particular aircraft.
We knew that something massive had happened suddenly, without warning.
It doesn't take long for the media to consider a sinister possibility. That Flight 611 was shot down. China and Taiwan have a combative relationship. China has fired missiles towards Taiwan in the past. There's suspicion in the media that China shot down Flight 611.
There were a lot of theories about, it was shooting down by enemy fire.
Only 8 months earlier, a Siberia Airlines flight with 78 people on board was shot down over the Black Sea. It was accidentally hit by a missile fired from Ukraine during a training exercise. On the day of the China Airlines crash, China was conducting military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. But officials there insist no missile was launched towards Flight 611. None of the wreckage recovered so far has any of the telltale signs of being hit. And there's no evidence on radar that there was ever a missile heading for Flight 611.
Once the evidence began to come in, it very quickly ruled out a missile, much the same way that it ruled out it being a mid-air collision. There were no other objects in the air near the airplane.
Few things would cause a plane to break up in mid-air. One of the big ones is a bomb. Medical examiners check the bodies that have been recovered for burn marks and shrapnel. They find none. The plane's metal skin would be torn and curled in a very particular way if there had been a bomb on board. Investigators find no such damage on any of the pieces. But to rule out a bomb, they'll have to find more wreckage.
I think that'll be it for floating wreckage.
The team from the NTSB arrives in Taiwan.
Morning, I'm Clint Crookshanks from the NTSB. Hello.
Good to see you, gentlemen. I'm afraid we still don't have much.
Clint Crookshanks is a structural engineer who knows the 747 intimately.
I didn't have any preconceived notions. This was my first major accident working for the NTSB.
We are not getting much from the floating debris. In-flight breakout. That's all we know.
Taiwan's Civil Aeronautics Authority doesn't take any chances. They ground all of China Airlines 747-200 series planes until they can be inspected for mechanical flaws. This puts added pressure on investigators to find out what happened.
Thank you for bringing these.
To the NTSB, this accident seems to have a lot in common with one of the world's most studied plane crashes. That of TWA Flight 800, 6 years earlier. Like the China Airlines flight, it broke into pieces while still climbing. That plane crashed into the Atlantic shortly after taking off from New York.
TWA Flight 800 was the biggest investigation the NTSB has ever done. It lasted about 4 years.
The painstaking investigation uncovered a design flaw with the 747. Wiring near one of the plane's fuel tanks could spark and ignite the fuel in the tank. Investigators conclude that's what likely caused the crash. Investigators are struck by similarities between the two flights. Both were 747s. Both disintegrated without warning while still climbing. Both flights took off in very hot weather. The heat may have caused Flight 800 to explode. That plane sat on the tarmac with its air conditioning running. Investigators believe hot air from the air conditioner overheated the plane's fuel. The early evidence is pointing to a repeat of TWA Flight 800.
So it looks really very, very similar. So therefore, our immediate focus was essentially the central fuel tank.
3 weeks after the crash, the Jan Steen, a sophisticated salvage vessel, arrives in the Taiwan Strait. It's equipped with divers, a diving chamber, and a remote-operated submarine, complete with sonar and video cameras.
The NTSB were tasked with manning the recovery vessel and watching video screens from the ROV.
Using sonar, investigators have located the wreckage of Flight 611 deep underwater.
All right, to the right a bit.
Clint Cruikshanks knows all the pieces that make up a 747, but he's never seen them like this.
It was really quite a shock when I first saw pieces on the floor of the ocean. With only the lighting of the ROV to guide you, you would notice something that looked like an airplane part. The ROV would then circle around the part, looking at it from all angles.
Cruikshank's job is to help the Taiwanese identify specific airplane parts among the wreckage.
I think it takes a different kind of mind to be able to look at a mangled part and kind of straighten it out in your head to really determine where it comes from on the airplane.
All right, a little bit more to the right. All right, go back. There, okay, that's definitely a piece of wing. Let's mark it.
Once a piece is identified, its GPS coordinates get recorded. The GPS mapping tells investigators that the debris is spread out over 325 square kilometers. It will be difficult to track down specific pieces of the plane. 25 days after the crash of Flight 611, the plane's 2 black boxes have been found. One contains voice recordings of conversations in the cockpit. The other, data from the plane's flight computer. Either could hold the clues that will reveal what happened during the final minutes of the flight. If the answer is on the tape, investigators may not have to bring up more wreckage to the surface. The data is critical.
Everybody ready?
Investigators begin with the plane's cockpit voice recorder. They hope that the pilots will have said something to each other about an emergency on board.
Welcome aboard, China Airlines.
The recording begins about 10 minutes before the plane took off.
20.
Preparations for the flight sound normal.
Okay, after start checklist. After start, anti-ice.
The crew checks all their systems and runs through standard checklists.
Off. Off.
It was very, very experienced crew. Both the captain and the first officers were quite seasoned.
Dynasty 611, runway 06, wind 050 at 9 are cleared for takeoff.
Clear for takeoff, Dynasty 611. Takeoff. $80. Check. V1. Rotate.
Flap 5. 1 green. Okay, flap up.
Investigators listen to more than conversations. They also want to hear if the plane itself was making any unusual sounds.
Noises on the cockpit voice recorder can either be audible spoken words that are recorded by a microphone, or they can be structural discrepancies that are picked up by the microphone.
Cockpit control.
If anything, though, this cockpit is unusually quiet. The captain seems relaxed.
200 knots, roger. Airway 608.
The microphones pick up the sound of controllers talking to other planes.
Asia 536, fly heading 050.
Heading 050.
In the moments before the disaster, nothing seems wrong. There are no unusual sounds.
Now descend and maintain 250.
The final words spoken in the cockpit are from Captain Yi Ching-fung.
2,000.
He calls out the distance to their cruising altitude. That's followed by the sound of a chime, alerting the crew that they're nearing 35,000 feet. And then the cockpit microphone picks up the sound of the plane breaking apart. Half a second later, the recording stops.
The cockpit voice recorder indicated that the conversation of the cockpit crew were totally normal, and all of a sudden just died.
The recorders told us that something happened, but it wasn't enough to tell us exactly what it was yet. Many things had been ruled out by then, but we didn't have the golden nugget. We didn't have the real piece of evidence that told us what initiated the breakup of this 747.
After the disappointment of the voice recorder, studying the wreckage becomes the only option for investigators. They focus their efforts on items that can either prove or disprove the link to TWA Flight 800.
So we play a lot of focus on the wreckage observation, examination of the central fuel tank.
On July the 12th, 48 days after the crash.
Okay, whoa, whoa. A little to the left, please.
Success.
All right. That's definitely the central fuel tank. Okay, let's mark that. Let's bring that up.
The tank joins the sea of wreckage piling up at the pier. Investigators study it closely for any evidence that it exploded. If it did explode like the TWA tank, it would be curled and twisted. And the metal would be bent outwards. But this fuel tank is different.
And we found the central fuel tank was relatively intact.
And it's crumpled inwards. Unlike the tank from the TWA flight, there's no soot. There would be if the jet fuel inside had ignited.
So at that time, we pretty much ruled out it was the cause of the central fuel tank.
The wreckage recovered so far has also forced investigators to abandon another theory, that a bomb brought down the plane.
None of the wreckage showed any evidence of sooting, any kind of explosive damage.
The China Airlines crash was neither a repeat of TWA Flight 800, nor a deliberate bombing. Investigators are running out of leads. As more wreckage is identified and recovered, investigators find an intriguing clue. It's discovered when they examine a series of small vents from Flight 611. All commercial jetliners have dozens of these vents near the floor. They're essentially pressure release valves. They're called dado panels, and there's only one reason for them to open. If the cargo area underneath the passengers were to suddenly decompress, the pressurized air above would exert so much force on the floor that it could collapse and damage vital flight controls. That's precisely what happened to a Turkish Airlines flight in 1974. The pilots couldn't control their plane after their cargo door blew out.
We've lost it!
If the floor on that flight hadn't collapsed, the pilots may have been able to save the plane. After that accident, the NTSB recommended that manufacturers install many more relief vents between a passenger plane's upper and lower levels. If there is decompression in the cargo area, the dado panels open automatically and release the pressure on the floor. There were 65 dado panels on the China Airlines flight. 19 of them were recovered from the ocean. 4 recovered panels were in the open position. It tells investigators that there must have been a sudden loss of pressure beneath the passenger cabin. But it doesn't tell them what caused it. The dado panels lead investigators closer to solving the mystery of this crash. But it's just a small piece of a much bigger puzzle. There are hundreds of pieces of wreckage to be examined for clues. Kay Young now wonders if a few of those pieces might be able to tell him where the decompression originated.
I've been reading about the trajectory analysis you did on Flight 800. I'd like to try it.
Ballistic trajectory analysis is a technique that US investigators used to figure out how TWA Flight 800 disintegrated. It's impossible to do without specialized computers.
We figure that because it disintegrated in the midair, the ballistic analysis from which the NTSB did in TW800 could be very, very useful to us to help us to analyze the trajectory of the flying debris.
The analysis is based on a simple fact. The pieces that came off the plane first would be the first to hit the water. If investigators can figure out which pieces those were, they'll know where the trouble began. Radar that had been tracking the plane as it climbed also ended up tracking pieces of debris as they fell. The salvage workers have recorded the precise location of those same pieces of wreckage. Their logs could match a specific piece to its radar track. Investigators know the wind speed on the day of the crash, and they can obtain precise information about ocean currents. The last piece of the puzzle comes from the plane's flight data recorder. The plane's altitude, speed, and direction at the time of the breakup. As they're brought to the dock, every single piece of wreckage has been logged and numbered for identification.
327.
Kay Young selects 18 pieces of wreckage for the computer analysis. Some from the front, some from the middle, and some from the back of the plane.
199.
Along with all the other data, he'll feed information about each item's weight and shape into the computer.
526.
Based on where the pieces fell, the computer should be able to calculate which of those 18 pieces was the first to come off the plane.
Can we see when each one of those items separated from the aircraft?
All of the data paints a telling picture of what happened at 35,000 feet. Kay Young gets to see how Flight 611 broke up, from beginning to end.
The tail came off first.
Along with the dado panels, it's a very important clue.
Well, that pretty much indicating that there's something happened in the back of the aircraft, rather than something happened in the forward part.
Investigators are now keen to recover items from the rear of the plane. Hundreds of pieces of wreckage are piling up at the pier on the Penghu Islands. The NTSB sends metallurgist Frank Zakar to Taiwan to examine the wreckage.
I was walking along the yard where the wreckage was placed, and at that time I walked up to item 640 and noticed that there were some peculiar areas of interest that I wanted to look at a little bit further.
With this battered piece of metal, investigators have struck gold.
There was definitely a eureka moment on the dock. That was, hey, we might have something here.
Hey, it's Frank. I think we found your golden nugget.
Item number 640 would give investigators a revealing glimpse into the past and lead them to conclude that the crash of Flight 611 actually began 22 years earlier.
Let's get as many pictures as we can.
The massive piece of fuselage that has caught Frank Zakar's attention is exactly what investigators have been searching for. It includes a piece of the belly, the sidewall, and the rear cargo door. It's from the back of the plane, precisely where the analysis told them the breakup had begun.
This piece of wreckage was highly unusual. It wasn't what we were seeing on all the other pieces, and it immediately drew our attention and drew the focus of the investigation.
The way most of the metal is torn suggests it ripped apart violently in midair.
aerodynamically, as an airplane's moving through the air, if it were to break apart, just the force of the incoming air at over 500 miles per hour will just break up perfectly good structure. That's what we call an overload fracture. So most of the pieces that came up early were just indicative of that kind of overload.
When metal breaks due to overload or overstress, it comes apart at an angle. But the fractured edges of piece number 640 aren't angled, they're flat.
What do you think?
It's definitely not overstress. It's metal fatigue.
Fatigue fractures happen when metal is stressed repeatedly over time until it breaks. It looks very different from a stress fracture.
Typically, a metal fatigue crack will have a flat appearance. It'll be very smooth.
That's exactly the kind of crack that investigators observe on piece number 640. That tells them it didn't break off the plane suddenly as it fell from the sky. This piece separated from the plane over time. Had it caused the deaths of 225 people?
There was much more work that needed to be done. A detailed analysis of the piece had to be done in order to see if this in fact was the smoking gun.
There's something else about this piece that stands out. It has a metal patch on it. It's called a doubler plate. It's the equivalent of a patch on a punctured tire. It's not unusual to find numerous doubler plates on older planes like this one.
A doubler plate is like a patch that you put over fuselage skin. If there were to be a tear or a blemish, a crack identified, you'd want to repair the fuselage back to its original strength, and one way to do that is to put a doubler plate or a patch right over the existing structure.
At some point, this section of the 747 had been repaired. Investigators need to know why it was fixed and how that was done.
We're looking for repair to the aft lower lobe. Whatever it was big.
Investigators sift through 22 years of documents. But the records are sketchy. Finding details on one particular repair could take time. There's something about this particular doubler that catches Frank Zakar's attention.
The outside of the fuselage contained longitudinal streaks that appeared to emanate from between the doubler plate and the skin.
Something is leaking from underneath the metal patch.
Was there a possibility that the skin had broken, cracked, and was there any fuel or air coming out from between the doubler and the fuselage? And that warranted further examination.
Let's cut it from here to here and send this piece to Chongshan.
In order to see what's underneath the doubler, a large section of piece 640 is sent to a lab. No evidence has been found of structural or mechanical problems with Boeing's 747-200 airplanes. Taiwanese aviation officials have no reason to keep the planes on the ground. The Chongshan Institute of Science and Technology is a military research facility. It's at the forefront of Taiwan's space program. This is where investigators take a section of piece number 640 for a closer examination. The NTSB's Frank Zakar finds a telling clue on the crack itself.
When I looked at the fracture surface, I found that this one specific area was covered with aluminum oxide, pretty much similar to rust on a car.
Years of exposure to oxygen changes the color of metal. The discoloration tells investigators that this particular crack at the rear of the airplane has been there for a very long time. Then, when the doubler is finally removed, Investigators get a look at the aluminium skin underneath. They're intrigued by what they see.
When we disassembled the doubler plate from the skin, we noticed that there were some fairly long gouge marks.
This is beyond the kind of damage a doubler is meant to patch.
That was an aha moment that we might have something here.
The search of the plane's documents also pays off. The records contain a very short reference to a mishap 22 years earlier, when this plane was only 6 months old.
Speed is low, sir. Watch it.
Its tail scraped the runway while landing.
Did you feel that?
It happens when a plane lands or takes off at too steep an angle. It's called a tail strike.
Dynasty 009, Hong Kong Tower. We observed smoke and sparks from your tail on landing.
Roger, Hong Kong Tower. We'll have that looked at. Tail strike, sir. I better log that.
It is a relatively common occurrence. It's not a good thing. Some airplanes even have what's called a bumper in that portion of the aft fuselage, so that if the tail ever does get too close to the ground, instead of sacrificing skin from the fuselage, you might have this sacrificial bumper that will take that wear.
Tail strike damage is routinely repaired. Investigators want to know how China Airlines went about fixing the plane. They can only find a brief mention of the repairs that were done in the plane's logbook.
That's all there is?
That's all we could find.
There's not a lot of detail in China Airlines records.
China Airlines indicating they could not find any of those documents. And when we start looking for it, we could not find any. And they said they probably got lost.
The documents that do exist show that the day after the tail strike, China Airlines did a temporary repair. Workers attached a large aluminium plate over the damaged area.
What do we know about the permanent repair?
It doesn't get much better.
A more permanent repair was to be carried out within 4 months.
This is what we got.
The maintenance records indicated that the permanent repair was done in accordance with Boeing recommendations in their structural repair manual. Evidence that we uncovered indicate that the repair was not done per the Boeing repair manual.
According to the manual, many of the scratches on the plane were too deep to be repaired. The entire damaged section should have been cut out and replaced.
You have to follow certain procedures, and the Boeing structural repair manual indicating very clearly what you should do step by step.
22 years later, investigators can tell that for some reason the damaged piece was not replaced. The scratches from the tail strike are still there. China Airlines engineers tell investigators that the scratched area was too large to cut out, so they sanded the scratches down instead.
In the event of scratching, it depends on how deep the scratches are. If they're not very deep, they can be blended out. But if the scratches are too deep, the repair technique that's called for is to actually cut out all of the scratched material and then design a doubler patch that's larger by a big percentage of the structure that was originally removed.
The scratches weren't sanded down or cut out. They're still there. Maintenance workers then made one final mistake.
They put the doubler plate right over the scratched material. The doubler plate that they put on was not 30% larger than the affected area. In fact, it was barely, maybe not even in certain locations, larger than the area that was scratched.
Even though the repair wasn't done according to Boeing's instructions, the way it was logged made it seem like it was. So for 22 years, anyone reading that entry would assume the damaged area had been cut out as it should have been.
Pieces were really starting to fall into place now. Once we saw this piece of structure that had the fatigue cracks in it, And we realized that it came from a structural repair that was not done properly, that was left to fly for 20 years.
Airborne passing 1,600.
Things began to make sense.
By covering an improper repair with a doubler and then documenting the repair as meeting Boeing standards, the workers made their mistake impossible to detect.
What was so insidious about this improper repair was that the doubler plate hid all of the damage. So if you weren't there watching them do this repair improperly, you wouldn't know that it was done improperly. You would have assumed that the structure underneath had been cut out the way it was supposed to.
And every time the plane took off over the next 20 years, the concealed problem got worse and worse. The air inside a commercial airplane is pressurized. As the plane climbs, air is forced into the cabin to keep the pressure inside the plane greater than the pressure outside. It's like inflating a tire. The inside air pushes against the plane's skin.
Each time the airplane pressurizes, pressure builds up inside the fuselage of the airplane. That crack could open up for a certain amount of inches or microns or millimeters.
The plane's skin expanded and contracted a little bit every time. Because they weren't properly repaired, the cracks grew and spread. Eventually, the crack grew into a stunning 2.3 meters.
If you were charting the crack, you would have seen very slow growth early, but as time went on, the growth was getting bigger and bigger.
A small scratch had grown into an enormous problem. Then in May 2002, as Flight 611 climbed, that problem killed 225 people.
As the airplane climbed in altitude and the fuselage was pressured, that put enough strain on this growing crack that it reached its critical length. And from there, it just spread like a spider web. It went in all directions, and it probably looped all the way around the fuselage to the point where the entire aft section of the airplane just broke off from the rest of the structure.
The plane went into a steep dive. The force of the air on what was left of the plane quickly ripped it to pieces. Investigators know that an unseen crack caused Flight 611 to break apart. They now discover that China Airlines came heartbreakingly close to finding that crack and saving 225 lives. The China Airlines 747 was in regular service for 22 years following the improper repair to its skin. It took off and landed more than 20,000 times. Over the years, mechanics would have scrutinized the plane.
There's regular inspections per the Boeing maintenance program that have to be performed on the airplane.
But the massive crack forming at the rear of the plane was never detected. Another accident in another country almost led China Airlines to discover the hidden damage. In 1988, the roof peeled off an aging Boeing 737 owned by Aloha Airlines. As a result of that incident, the Federal Aviation Administration laid out an inspection procedure for older planes. Airlines around the world were forced to inspect their planes much more diligently for corrosion and cracks. The regulation called for airlines to reevaluate all existing repairs to a plane's structure.
Indications on this airplane were that if they had looked at the maintenance records and compared it to the repair, they would have had to remove the repair and redo it.
China Airlines took the first steps of the new procedure in 2001, a year before the accident. The airline identified and photographed 31 different doublers on the 747, including the one over the catastrophic crack. Those pictures show investigators that China Airlines overlooked a vital clue that could have warned them of the looming danger.
We examined the photographs that China Airlines took of the repair, and noticed that there was some issues that may have warranted further investigation.
Investigators see a dark brown stain on the outside of the plane. It's the same mysterious staining that led Frank Zakar to suspect there was a hole behind the doubler when he first saw it on the pier. So why hadn't this stain raised alarms before the crash? For years, passengers on China Airlines' doomed 747 were allowed to smoke. They filled the pressurized air with nicotine. The smoke was being forced out through the crack at the rear of the plane. Over time, that smoke left a nicotine stain on the outside of the plane.
It was very vivid. Any experienced maintenance engineer be able to spot it right immediately.
Smoking hadn't been allowed on China Airlines for 7 years before the crash. It tells investigators that the crack in the plane had been there for at least that long. But instead of investigating the source of the staining,
we need to conduct the new inspection when we do our next major check.
China Airlines scheduled the second part of the FAA's procedure, a detailed inspection of the repaired areas.
And that would be the 7C check, currently scheduled for November the 2nd, 2002.
But the 747 never made it to November 2nd, 2002. It came apart over the Taiwan Strait 5 months before the inspection that would have undoubtedly uncovered its hidden flaw. Investigators want to prevent a similar accident from ever happening again. They recommend that aviation agencies around the world immediately inspect repairs for any possible hidden damage.
We were no longer going to accept just a quick write-up that the repair was done properly. If the repair didn't have all the necessary documentation to allow us to know it was done properly, we were requiring operators to take doubler plates off and do a visual inspection of the structure underneath.
The National Transportation Safety Board issues its own recommendations. The board asks that maintenance personnel be warned of the consequences of hiding the kind of damage that could lead to the structural failure of an airplane.
The moral of this story is that the repair has to be done properly. As a mechanic, when you're doing work on an airplane, you're not thinking about the people who might be flying on that fuselage 20 years from now, but their safety depends on you doing the repair properly.
China Airlines has revised the way its fleet is inspected and maintained. Its safety record has improved dramatically since the crash of Flight 611. Investigators also proposed the development of new tools that would allow mechanics to detect damage behind a doubler. Such tools are being used today.
Boeing developed a non-destructive procedure that can find cracks in the fuselage underneath the doubler.
That device uses ultrasound, sound waves that travel through metal. It can reveal damage underneath a doubler. It's the same technology that allows doctors to observe a fetus while it's still inside the womb. The device would have been able to detect the crack behind Flight 611's doubler plate. But the technology has some limitations.
A great number of hours are required just to do one specific area of the airplane, but the technology is getting better.
The problems that led to the China Airlines disaster are not going away. Planes the world over are getting older. And older planes need to be more thoroughly inspected for cracks. 6 years after the China Airlines crash, Southwest Airlines in the United States was hit with a record-breaking fine. $10.2 million for missing inspections designed to find cracks.
The finding of Southwest brings back into focus how important it is to do maintenance properly on an airplane.
A proper program of maintenance and inspections can be costly. But as China Airlines showed, the price of not maintaining aging planes is even costlier.